Well, I have noticed the fun of this as I travel around the country and go to these kind of events that the people that needed to be in this room, I don't know if you met them out in the hall, they're amazingly absent from the whole discussion. So I have gotten to meet the next presenter several times, Joel Schwartz, a member of the American Enterprise Institute. And I always remember him because Joel has the greatest smile and the greatest handshake. So if you haven't met him, you have to meet him out in the hallway. But we have a lot of other things that we are passionate about that we get to study together, transportation issues, chemicals, and this fun global warming stuff. So welcome, Joel Schwartz.
Maybe I ought to go with that. Right. Thank you, Senator Youngbauer, for that introduction. I'm going to talk to you about air pollution as a case study of climate activism in a scientific guise. The thing that air pollution has to do with climate change is that a number of scientists are claiming that as the climate warms, it's going to increase air pollution levels by creating weather events like stagnant air and less ventilation and greater warmth that allows air pollution to build up. I'm going to show you that those claims are false, and that the way the scientists who are making this claim manufacture these future air pollution increases is by assuming that emissions will increase in the future. It's really the increased emissions in the future that cause the higher air pollution in these climate models. And climate change alone is actually a small factor, and it actually would probably increase pollution levels in some areas and decrease them in others. But overall, it's the emissions that are most important, and emissions are going to decline a lot over the next several decades. And so by the time the climate warms, if it does keep warming, and regardless of the cause of that warming, the air pollution isn't really going to be an issue anyway, because we'll have gotten rid of the emissions that are a problem in the first place. I'm going to show you that scientists have actually obscured this fact in their research, even in the scientific literature and certainly in their statements to the press. And many of these scientists are even working with environmental groups to mislead the public about air pollution under a changing climate. So first, let me show you some data on air pollution trends. This is the average U.S. temperature trend from 1970 to 2006 from GISS, Goddard Institute for Space Studies. This is the average number of days exceeding the federal 8-hour ozone standard. That's on this axis, the temperature's on this axis. And this is the average levels of fine particulate matter. That's called PM2.5, particulate matter under 2.5 microns. We have some data that from a special study that EPA did back in the early 80s for about 80 metropolitan areas, and this is data collected during the last few years in those same areas. So you can see that the past has been rising temperatures, about a 1 degree Fahrenheit rise on average during the last 35 years or so, and at the same time, large declines in air pollution. And those declines happen across the board, not just ozone and particulates, but every kind of air pollution we measure. This is the percentage change from 1980 to 2005 in what are called the criteria air pollutants. These are the 6 major air pollutants that EPA has standards for: lead, ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds, fine particulates, oxides of nitrogen, and this is ozone measured as peak levels. This is ozone measured as days exceeding the standard. So we've had these big percentage declines in air pollution in the last 25 years. Just as a sidelight, I think it's important to also note that these declines happen at the same time that we drastically increase the amount that we drive, the amount of coal we burn for energy, and so on. So we're decreasing the emissions much more rapidly than we're increasing the things that we normally think of as polluting. So cars are getting cleaner, power plants are getting cleaner, and so on. Now, these declines are going to continue because we've already taken the steps that are necessary to get rid of most of the remaining emissions. We've gotten rid of most of the pollution that was in the air 30 or 40 years ago, and we're going to get rid of most of the remaining air pollution during the next couple of decades. Just a few examples. EPA's Clean Air Interstate rule requires about a 70% reduction in sulfur dioxide and about a 50% reduction in nitrogen oxides from power plants. EPA's rules for motor vehicles, the 2004 Tier 2 standards and the 2007 heavy-duty truck standards and the 2010 non-road diesel standards all require about 90% reductions in emissions from new vehicles compared to previous standards. So these declines in pollution are going to continue. Now, despite this reality of past declines in air pollution despite warming and future continued declines in the emissions that are causing the air pollution, there are a lot of papers in the literature that claim air pollution is going to increase. And this is one of them that was published in Nature last year by Stephen Sitch and colleagues at the Hadley Center for Climate. The premise of this paper is that ozone levels are going to increase in the future. That's going to harm plant growth because plants take up carbon dioxide. That's actually going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's going to have a feedback effect that increases the amount of greenhouse warming from carbon dioxide. And I want to show you that this study's results are false in every possible way. First of all, the emissions they use, the assumed emissions between 2000 and 2100. This is the scenario they use. They use the IPCC's A2 scenario for emissions of greenhouse gases and of air pollutants that form ozone, like nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. I'm showing you NOx. The results for the volatile organic compounds are pretty much the same. So this is what the A2 scenario says is going to happen between 1990 and 2100. This is for OECD countries. These are the wealthy countries of the world. So the US, the European Union, Australia, and a few other countries. These are the actual emissions estimates from the European Environment Agency and from EPA from 1990. I've indexed everything to a value of 1 in 1990. So this is the IPCC. This is reality. No discussion of actual emissions in this study that was published in Nature. And yet, not a lot of newspapers reported on the study as if it were telling us something real. Another thing this study didn't do was to check whether their modeled ozone levels even matched current ozone levels. And in fact, they don't. This is what the Nature papers modeled ozone levels average was for the US. This is the actual average for the US from the 1980s to the early 2000s. So their ozone levels are about 70% higher than the real ozone levels, but they never, once again, never mention in the paper any comparison of model to reality. And clearly the referees and the journal editor didn't ask them to make this comparison, which seems crazy to me. How can you do a model and not compare it to reality? This is the worst, this is the average for the US. This is the worst site in the country, the Crestline, California near San Bernardino. So this is what their model says for the average US, but they're really right around the highest in the US. Interesting thing about this is that, as they say in the paper, damage to plants only starts to occur once ozone gets above about 40 parts per million. So, of course, their model even now says that there's damage to plants from ozone, but the US average is actually below that threshold in their paper. So their whole premise is simply false. In fact, not only does the IPCC get the trend wrong, they get the absolute values wrong too. And this is from a talk that was given by Marcus Amann from the International Applied Systems Analysis, a think tank in Europe that does population and other demographic estimates. So here's EASA's estimates of actual world emissions, Northern Hemisphere emissions. And here's once again the A2 scenario. This is for volatile organic compounds. So this is what the IPCC says is going into the air. This is the estimated value, actual value for the world. And once again, of course, the A2 scenario going up, real emissions, the light blue, that's the US going down, Europe going down. So in every possible way, the scenario has nothing to do with reality, and yet in this Nature paper, they used it as if it was a real estimate of what's going to happen in the future. And Nature, of course, has a news section at the beginning of the journal every week on the latest news in science. And sometimes they highlight papers that are published in the journal. The news article, they did a news article on this Sitch et al. Paper that was headlined, "Carbon Sinks Threatened by Increasing Ozone." Rising levels of ozone pollution over the coming century will erode the ability of plants to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, a new climate modeling study predicts. And it has absolutely nothing to do, once again, with reality. Okay, so let's go to another example. This one I think is far more egregious. In November of 2004, a group of researchers from several major universities, as well as NASA and other government labs, published a paper called "Assessing Ozone-Related Health Impacts Under a Changing Climate." What they said was that ozone in the US is going to increase in the future due to climate change. And because of that, more people are going to die from ozone. And they followed up just last year in Climatic Change a few months ago with another paper, but basically on the same subject. Now, what they did in those two papers is they used U.S. emissions of ozone-forming pollutants, NOx and VOC, in 1996 to predict, in quotes, ozone levels in the 2050s. So in a paper published in 2004, they were using emissions from 1996, and they used those same 1996 emissions in a 2007 paper. So this is emissions in the US in 1996 of NOx, VOC, and carbon monoxide, which also contributes a little bit to ozone. I've indexed everything to a common value of 1 in 1996, so you can see percentage changes over time. These are all EPA estimates of emissions. This is the trend, downward. So by the time these papers were published, ozone-forming emissions had already declined a great deal from 1996, and yet they were assuming that in 2050 emissions would be the same as they were in 1996. So of course they got higher ozone levels than we have now, and it wasn't because of the climate change, it was because they were assuming higher emissions. And they were even disingenuous, I think, about the emissions, because they said, and this is a quote from the paper in 2004, ozone precursor emissions were held at the 1990, constant at the 1996 county level. Thus, no projected changes in anthropogenic precursor emissions were applied. They never mentioned that emissions were declining all the way through the time until their paper was published. They make believe that these are constant emissions from 1996 onward, which it just isn't true. And so the emissions they used for VOCs were about 50% too high compared to where they are now, and about 35% too high for NOx and CO compared to where they are now. And their 2004 paper was focused on the New York area, where they said ozone in New York is going to increase between now and 2050. Once again, they didn't talk about what was happening in the past. Is the future going to be different or the same as the past? Well, they didn't even talk about the past, but here's what was happening in the past. This is ozone in the New York metropolitan area from 1980 to 2006, and these are days greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the New York area. So with warming, as you'd expect, the number of days greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit was increasing. That should increase ozone, all else being equal. All else being equal, more warmth is going to give you a little more ozone. But in fact, we have these big declines in ozone from 1980 to 2006 because the emissions were declining. And so even with warmer temperatures, so even with 2002, which was a very hot year, a lot of hot, warm days, here's where we had, and in fact, ozone was a little bit higher, but compared to where it was back in the early 1980s, when you had warm days in the early 1980s, you got ozone that was about 30 or 40% higher than it was just a few years ago when we had a hot day. The effective temperature on ozone is decreasing because we're getting rid of the emissions that form ozone. Now, the scientists who did those two papers in climatic change and environmental health perspectives also wrote a report for the Natural Resources Defense Council. So here are scientists not only entering the debate as essentially as activists under a scientific guise, they're even writing reports for environmental groups to help try and scare the public about climate change by making these false claims that ozone is going to increase in the future. Now, when the 2004 paper came out in Environmental Health Perspectives, that's Knowlton et al., I wrote a letter to the editor along with Pat Michaels and Bob Davis, where we called them on using these fake inventories of emissions and exaggerating ozone levels in the future. And here's what they replied. Schwartz et al. Suggest incorrectly that our model runs were intended to project what is likely to actually happen with ozone and mortality in the 2050s under a changing climate. Had we wished to do that, we would have needed to include realistic estimates of ozone precursor changes over the period of interest. However, because there are no reliable estimates of precursor emissions extending to the mid-21st century, such an exercise would have been extremely speculative. So modeling the climate in 2050 isn't extremely speculative, but using ozone-forming emissions that are much too high for the 2050s is okay. That's not too speculative. Now, even this was really, frankly, a lie because they said, oh, we weren't really trying to predict what was going to happen with ozone. We were just doing a feasibility study. Well, if you go back to their own paper, it says, when a more fully elaborated picture of the likely regional future was evaluated, that is, including population growth and anthropogenic ozone precursor emissions increases. So they're saying the likely future is actually increasing ozone precursors rather than decreasing precursors. So their whole response was essentially a lie, and the editor of the journal let them get away with it, unfortunately. And of course, they claim they weren't making a prediction, but of course, they also wrote this paper for NRDC claiming that that global warming is causing more bad air days. It is really, I thought, just outrageous. Now, that was the 2004 Heat Advisory Report. Along with the climatic change article in 2007, the same authors published an update to that report where, once again, they said excuse me, this is from the 2004 report. Just once again, in NRDC's report, researchers project under a climate change scenario that by mid-century, people living in 15 cities in the eastern United States would see a 60% increase in the average number of days exceeding the 8-hour ozone standard. So once again, they're claiming we weren't trying to predict the future, and then in their NRDC report, they're saying, of course, ozone's going to increase because of climate change. Now, I wrote another critique of the 2007 climatic change paper and the heat advisory report, and this time NRDC's Dan Lashoff responded to that critique, and he said, the project on which heat advisory is based kept anthropogenic ozone precursor emission levels constant as a way of evaluating the effect that climate change alone could have on ozone concentrations. Well, that's misleading. First of all, they weren't constant. They were 35 to 50% higher than current ozone-forming emissions. And second of all, that's backwards. If you want to find out the effect of future climate change on ozone, you want to get an estimate of what you think ozone-forming emissions will be 50 years from now, and then run your model with and without climate change. And that would give you the effect of climate change separate from the ozone-forming emissions. And then NRDC said, while we would expect significant reductions in ozone precursor emissions over the next decade, there are no reliable estimates of precursor emissions extending to the mid-21st century. So once again, they're working from the same playbook that the scientists who wrote the paper are working from. They're saying, oh, there are no reliable estimates, it's too uncertain, therefore we'll assume they're going to increase even though we know they're going to decrease. It's just, once again, just crazy stuff, but it really happened. And the other amazing thing is that NRDC certainly knows that emissions are really going to decrease a lot, because they put out press releases every time EPA adopts a regulation that requires large emission reductions. And here's some of those press releases. EPA rule means progress against diesel pollution according to NRDC. That's from 2004, 90 to 95% reduction in non-road diesel. New diesel fuel hitting pumps nationwide October 15th cuts pollution. 95% reduction from on-road trucks. EPA touts new cleaner cars, 77 to 95% cleaner than current models for automobiles. NRDC knows exactly what's going on in terms of ozone-forming emissions, yet they're claiming that ozone is going to increase in the future. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to a study that is a breath of fresh air because it's one of the few studies that has actually tried to do realistic estimates of future ozone-forming emissions and then look at the effect of climate change based on those lower emissions. This is a paper that was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research by Ted Russell's group at Georgia Tech. The work was done for NESCOM with the Northeastern States for Coordinated Air Use Management. That's a coalition of regulatory agencies in the Northeastern United States. So what they did was they tried to come up with an estimate of future emissions. And they also applied some climate warming using the IPCC's A1B scenario for CO2 emissions. So they had NOx and sulfur dioxide dropping by 50% and VOC emissions by dropping more than 40%. Human-caused VOC emissions dropping more than 40%. Some increase in natural VOC emissions from the warmer temperatures from vegetation. Here's the quote from their paper. The combined effect of climate change and emission reductions leads to a 20% decrease in mean summer ozone and a 23% decrease in mean PM2.5. It's the emissions that matter. And in fact, according to their modeling, around the U.S., in some areas, climate change result in a little bit less decline in air pollution, and in some places it actually resulted in a little bit more decline in air pollution. And the net effect was really about zero, and it was really the emissions that mattered for getting rid of the air pollution. It's one of the few honest studies of the effect of climate change on air pollution. Even they were I think a bit too pessimistic on how much emissions are going to go down. If you look at actual NOx emission reductions, NOx has already declined between 2001 and 2006. It declined more than they assumed for the entire period from 2001 to 2020. VOC has already declined more than half the amount they predicted for 2001 to 2020, and we're seeing pollution declining more rapidly than they predicted. So we should consider their study even as a bit too pessimistic, even though they find pollution declines. Here's just one. There are many more examples, but here's just one, the latest one. This was just published a few weeks ago in Geophysical Research Letters by Mark Jacobson of Stanford University. Has the title, On the Causal Link Between Carbon Dioxide Air Pollution and Mortality. And Jacobson says ozone levels are going to increase in the future due to climate change. He uses emissions from 2002 to predict ozone levels during the 21st century. Once again, doesn't mention that emissions are declining, doesn't mention that the past has been just the opposite. We've had increasing temperature and declining air pollution. Once again, another study, and this was reported all over the press, and Jacobson was quoted claiming that thousands more people are going to die because of ozone due to climate change. No discussion of the real declines in air pollution that are occurring and that will continue to occur. I just want to close with one final piece of data on this, something you'll never see in any of these papers, unfortunately, which is the likelihood of an ozone exceedance day on a day that's greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This is data from 10 cities that I've averaged: Atlanta, Baltimore, Chicago, Cincinnati, Charlotte, Houston, LA, Nashville, New York, and Philadelphia. I picked them because they're among the highest ozone cities in the country. I got temperature trend data, number of days greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit per year in each of those cities, and then average number of days per year exceeding the 8-hour ozone standard and the 1-hour ozone standard. And I divided the ozone exceedances, the number of ozone exceedances by the number of days greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And here's that ratio from the early 80s through 2005. And you can see that the likelihood of an ozone exceedance on a hot day has been decreasing very rapidly. In fact, for the 1-hour ozone standard, there are almost no 1-hour ozone exceedances anywhere anymore, regardless of how hot it gets. That's why that's almost 0 now. And for the 8-hour ozone standard, that's the tougher new standard, you can see that there's a sharp downward trend, and that we'll be at the point several years from now where 8-hour ozone exceedances will also be unlikely, even on hot days. So we have this situation where scientists nominally claiming to be doing dispassionate research on the effect of climate change on air pollution are in fact, even in the research literature, the peer-reviewed research literature, putting out false and misleading information and then obfuscating that fact when they get called on it. And so we have this situation where climate scientists and air pollution scientists are entering the debate as activists under the guise of doing dispassionate research. And you know, to me, it worries me because if in the area of climate science that I know best, I can tell that the research is bunk. It makes me wonder, you know, how much I should trust the climate research in areas where I'm less directly familiar. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.